My name is Tracy Huzzy, and we will be reviewing excessive force and peaceful encounters, some of the legality around that, and also we'll take a look at a Florida case. Kind of go over that together. So my thesis is by analyzing the way Florida views excessive force in individual cases and reviewing police protections that allow excessive force to occur, I consider solutions to combat against a plague to our local communities. So the main things that we're going to be taking a look at are reviewing some police protections, not all of them, and reviewing some, or in this particular case, reviewing a excessive force case for the purposes of time. So, and just taking a deeper dive into the thesis, a national code is a police protection, statutory codes are police protections, and precinct policies, right? So there's the national government, so usually the Supreme Court, it's considered national or actual national laws, United States codes annotated, and federal rules of procedure. These would be all national codes. Statutory code, Florida statutes. Precinct policy would be considered anything that is specific to a local city department. So just to take a look at one of those, as far as national protections, United States Codes annotated, United States Code 42 annotated from 1983 states that a valid seizure is when an officer has probable cause to make an arrest, or they need reasonable suspicion, or they need to have a valid legal reason to be essentially seizing you, to potentially detain you, or to make an arrest. As far as Florida Chapter 901, it goes over arrests, and it says that reasonable force is reasonable when it is to defend themselves or others from harm. So those are the cases where it's reasonable, when it's to defend themselves or others from harm. And the courts will interpret that differently, what constitutes others in a particular case, and what constitutes defending themselves and what kind of force they can use. But it's prohibited and may result in disciplinary action or criminal charges against the officer. So what that means is that if they find that you've done something without the scope of what the precinct has said that you're allowed to do within the arrest of a case, depending on these circumstances given, your actions were unreasonable, and depending on the lethality or the degree of how serious that unreasonableness is, then you could be criminally charged and prosecuted. As far as local precinct policy, they may have certain things that say, oh, you can apprehend someone like this, or, you can only use this particular type of choke, right? Or you have to hold your gun this way. You can only hold your gun like that. You can only have this type of gun on your person, right? These are all local precinct policies that govern arrest, and then even govern the officers themselves on other things that they can do and hold on themselves during policing out in the police force. So looking at the case in Tamar Crawford, in 2019, he was fatally killed by Florida police officers, specifically Pensacola police officers he was killed by, unfortunately. Detective Simon fired 7 shots after stepping back, and his colleagues moved out of his way, surprised by the gunfire. So in this particular case, Crawford was reasonably suspected for something, maybe drugs or whatever the case may be. And during the incident, he grabbed the taser of the officer and resisted arrest. He didn't want to be arrested. And the officer saw this as a threat. But the threat is unreasonable because the actions don't match up to what actually happened. The degree of lethality did not match up, right? So as far as Crawford was not supposed to resist arrest, he was also supposed to do it, that the officer was supposed to handle that in a way that didn't require taking his life, because they don't match up. So that's kind of what happened in this case. So why is this topic and argument important? Well, excessive force affects everybody. It starts with a police victim, someone loses their life, and that can happen in multiple different ways. Um, as far as whether it's a traffic stop, whether we've seen it, suspected of drug deals or whatever the case may be, someone loses their life because of some reason, whether they were innocent initially or actually suspect already of criminal activities. These families mourn this loss and lose trust in the police officials. So you kind of stop expecting the people who are supposed to protect you if they're doing these things against their own citizens that they're policing. Also, the government reviews these cases favorable to officers majority of the time. So what this means is that the officers actually are winning approval 9 out of 10 times in a court of law. So overwhelmingly, case law supports the officer's immunity in a case, right? So whether they did something wrong or not, and then that's a key thing to play on, the key thing to pay attention to, is that whether or not this person or this officer used unreasonable force, they still win these cases because of qualified immunity, which we'll touch on. And officers they don't get disciplined, so they repeat the allowed behaviors. They think that it's allowable, right? So why would I stop handling my arrests this way moving forward if I was allowed to get away with it the first time? Or why would I stop other disciplinary actions? Why would I stop gambling if I only got a pat on the hand? It's the pat on the hand theory. It's the theory that anybody that doesn't get the discipline comparative to what the action actually is, they're more likely to repeat it again because they don't realize the significance of what they've done, right? And then as far as people become more likely to become a victim because the cases just keep continuing. So that's why this topic is important. And then as far as the argument and how important that argument is we should uphold our legal protections to support victim rights. Specifically, victim rights is to not forget about the point of what this all is and who we're addressing. We're addressing the victim in this. And the Florida Crime Bill in 2018 provides specific ways that these victims should be treated with fairness and respect. The right to be heard and present during proceedings. They have the right to listen and be in tune with what's happening in the hearings and the court cases and view the faces of their accusers or all these types of elements, or the accusers are able to. So it just needs to be clear, and they need to be able to be present during the whole thing and be considered outside of the case and how the judge is viewing it. So the gaps in previous literature. Well, the biggest gap is that there's just insufficient case law in Florida, right? There's new treatment. There's not many high-profile cases concerning excessive force within the last 10 years. We see a few here and there. And then as far as that goes, it's just recently expanded as well. So the bill itself, Crime Victim Bill of Rights, was just revised in 2018. It's been a thing for a while, over I think since the 80s or 90s, and essentially it just hasn't been in question enough. So recently, the new protections have been revised, and we just haven't seen cases to uphold the integrity of its importance, right? And in case law, something becomes more important the more treatment that it actually receives, right? And it becomes persuasive once the victims are actually winning the cases, and that's a point that we don't know when is actually going to happen yet. As far as more common legal situations, is that there's just more other day-to-day infractions that people get involved with than the police. So excessive force cases don't happen day-to-day anywhere, or at least they're just not talked about every day. Right? We're not seeing media attention to it. We're not seeing journal review articles. We're not seeing news reports, whether it's in the newspaper or on the news. We just don't see it happen frequently. And we just have other run-ins with the police officers. So findings and opinions. So One of the biggest findings is that responsive technology does exist. The Portals Policing Project goes over this. This is a piece of technology very recently, within the last 5 years, has been used by Yale professors, Professor Weaver and some other students. Some of her students at Yale actually helped her come to this study that it initially was. It was a project. It was a study to see how people could express dialogue in their neighborhood about the policing environment, right? Like what's going on, even just day to day, outside of excessive force cases. Let's just be more comfortable to talk to your neighbor, have a conversation with them about what you're experiencing. And the whole point of it is to get a political viewpoint of what people in lower income neighborhoods actually feel about their treatment of officiating around them. So another one of my findings is the Florida victims have recent consideration, right? It's too long. It shouldn't be 2018 where rights has got expanded. So we just need to see more treatment. Low profile cases don't have media attention, which we just talked about, right? Even the day-to-day cases that are happening, the ones that are happening more frequently, we still don't hear about them. They're still swept under the rug. So you need to have more attention. Officers also have biased examiners. Local hearings, local civilian hearings, they hear these cases. They're usually pro-police. And we can assume they're pro-police based on the results of disciplinary actions unrelated to excessive force, right? Because excessive force studies are already harder to see, harder to find. But even minor disciplinaries usually get swept under the rug, and officers are able to actually stay on the force, which means that by case law, regardless of if the people are biased or not, the cases are biased and are overwhelmingly supporting officers to stay on the force during disciplinary action. Also, too, policies govern specific behaviors and arrests. That's a new finding for me, right? The fact that the arrest behavior within local precinct policy is actually discussed, is actually governed, is not just on a state level. So that's something new to find out. As far as my opinion, we need to leverage these technologies, right? So Portals Policing Project, we need to see it more than in Milwaukee and Los Angeles and some of these other cities, these major cities. We need to see them in day-to-day cities. We need to see them in Sanford, Florida, right? And even if we start big cities, Tampa, we need to see them in Orlando. We just need to see them in the bigger cities and let them be the test subjects for how it's actually going to work out. We need to know our legal protections a lot better, right? So people need to actually understand what the state laws are. They need to understand what the police policy law, the precinct policies are local to where they live. Low profile cases need to have more attention. So that's another huge opinion. We need to give more attention to the lower profile cases, even though they're not high profile, or maybe the incident didn't even involve lethal force, right? It's usually the ones like that. Maybe it was just choking or arrest or beating, but anything that involves anything of any kind of unreasonable force needs to be reported more often. We need to hold more officers more accountable for abusing their power, potentially even criminally charged, right? If they need to be criminally charged, we need to arrest them and start sending them, start holding them accountable for the crimes that they're committing, battery, beating, potential suspects. So all these things that we talked about. We also need to have stricter policies of what is acceptable in the first place for forceful behavior. So maybe the policies allow too much wiggle room for the police officers to play around with, right? Maybe they're allowed to use this choke, but this choke shouldn't even be a choke in the first place, right? Maybe an examiner, whoever's an expert on physical, on anatomy, and people can look into what kind of chokes or what kind of behavior is actually allowable around an arrest. So then the policies need to reflect that strictness, because it can't be broad and open. So my conclusion is that we need to understand our national protections, statutory protections, and case law protections to strengthen our response to qualified immunity, right? Qualified immunity, the system that allows the government to continue the behavior, right? So we can only strengthen our response to it. We can't take away their protection, so we can do our best to be comparative to it, right? And then officers when they go against the very rules they enforce, the lines are blurred and citizens lose trust. So we will continue to lose trust if this does not change.